Okay, everyone, you're very welcome to join us to the February 2026 LGBT History Club with the LGBTQIA plus Heritage Project. This evening we have a presentation from the fabulous Jude Copeland, and he is going to do a presentation on the life and legacy of Mark Ashton. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So we hope you enjoy. Sit back and relax and enjoy.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining. I think the format of today or tonight will just be a quick presentation from me and lots of chat and discussion afterwards. I think that's the value of this club. So hopefully you can see a screen with a photo of Mark Ashton in the middle of it. Well, I've achieved something tonight then. That's really, really good. So, this is all about Mark Ashton and how a small group of LGBTQIA activists built an unlikely alliance with striking minors. So, we're going to talk a little bit about Mark's life, his political activism, his activism with LGSM, his impact on those around him, his friends and his family, and then wider society, and then his legacy. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to have a little bit of a question and answer session at the end. So, just a little bit of a trigger warning. Um, this will cover AIDS, and it will also cover stigma and homophobia. So just please be aware of that. And obviously, help is available from Here NI if you need that. So, what we're going to discuss tonight was a bit about who Mark Ashton was, what lesbian and gay support the minors did, because it's LGBTQIA plus History Month, and why it matters today. So, Mark was born on the 19th of May, 1960, and he was a British stroke Irish. He was although he was born in Oldham, he was very proud of his Irish identity. And he was a gay rights activist and co-founder of Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors. Really significantly, he was also a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain and was General Secretary of the Young Communist League. So there's a little arrow you should be able to see towards somebody hiding in the corner of this photo, and that is Mark. And I guarantee you that everybody on this call will be familiar with the work of some of the other people in the photo. This is Mark with some of his friends, the band The Undertones, and they were really, really good friends. What I really love is that Mark was really a part of the North Coast Riviera, which is Portrush, and he lived there and had a brilliant upbringing, really, really safe, very secure, with surrounded by lots of love from his family and from local people. And what I really love is that he went to the Northern Ireland Hotel and Catering College, and a number of his friends and family are still, sorry, a number of his friends are still really significant figures in the catering industry locally. All of this period of his life, up until 1982, it was a criminal offence to be gay in Northern Ireland. And it was really odd because whenever he got on his plane from, it was actually a boat, whenever he got on his boat from Belfast to England, it was illegal for him to be gay in Northern Ireland, but it was legal for him to be gay in England and Wales. And he had a number of different opportunities and really sort of influential people in his life. In his life, he had a number of brilliant friends who really closely guard his memory and celebrate his life, both in Portrush and over in England and Wales. Really significantly, in 1982, he went on a trip to Bangladesh, and that's probably a little bit of an odd thing to do, but it was because his dad was involved in the textile industry. And by that, I mean he was part of the team that brought textile machinery from Derry to Bangladesh. So there were the old shirt factories from Derry. They were getting rid of their old machinery and they were selling it off to Bangladesh. And Mark went out there with his parents to spend some time with them. And it was there that he realized the great disparity in well-being and life that he had enjoyed in Portrush and the exceptional poverty that he witnessed uh, in Bangladesh. And that was really a bit of an awakening for him. A number of his friends have told me that that was a huge uh, that had a huge impact on him, both emotionally, physically, politically, and in terms of activism. One of his good friends said to me that whenever he came back from Bangladesh, he had slightly lost his sparkle. He wasn't the same happy go lucky person that he had been before. He was really irreverent and was a really vibrant part of Portrush life. And that really just changed him a little bit, going and witnessing that exceptional poverty. I've mentioned that I mentioned that he was a political activist, and really it was those experiences in Bangladesh that really informed his socialism and his politics. It also gave him an insight into solidarity and the power of organizing. And whenever he was in England, he very quickly became a very active participant in society. So he joined the Young Communist League and held leadership roles in it. And it was kind of interesting because there's this dichotomy. He also had a really brilliant sort of social side to him. He was a real people person. And the Reverend Richard Coles talked about this period where Mark had just arrived in England and said that Mark had worked for a while as a barman in the Conservative Club in King's Cross. This was a really vibrant part of London at the time. But rather, he was a barmaid. He was in drag and he wore a large blonde beehive wig. And Richard says that he was never really sure if the patrons worked out whether he really was a man. So there was very early exploration of gender and drag around that period. It was really it was after his return from the visit to Bangladesh, 3 months there, and it really did have a profound effect on him. It triggered him into volunteering with the London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard. He began actively supporting the campaign for nuclear disarmament, and he really ramped up his activism with the Young Communist League. There's a really lovely video from this period where Mark talks about who he is and also about solidarity and about his queerness. And it's a really beautiful short film. It's publicly available and we'll circulate some links after. But it's called Framed Youth, and it actually won a really prestigious award as a documentary. So he was already in the middle of activism, and I think one of the really powerful things for me is the series "It's a Sin," which aired during COVID, and for me that seems to really very accurately depict the time period that Mark was doing a lot of his activism. So Mark was at Switchboard. He was listening to people who were having all sorts of problems with their sexuality and gender identity. And more particularly, they were having issues with discrimination, harassment, and the real hardship caused by the really harsh, hostile environment created, well, Mark would probably say created by the media and by right wing influences. Um, he also would have been answering calls from people who really were very, very scared. This was at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, and that was a very, very difficult time for the LGBTQIA plus community. But I think it's really significant that Mark was there helping people and listening to them at the very beginning. In the middle of this, there was the miners' strike, and this was a national strike against pit closures. And it was a time of huge political unrest. Margaret Thatcher, who I would assume needs no introduction to anybody on this call, took a very firm line in relation to the miners and also in relation to the LGBTQIA plus community. And really, it was part of this um, that triggered in Mark the realization that the way that the miners were being treated by politicians and about how they were being treated by the media was very, very similar to how LGBTQIA plus people were being treated. And the miners' strike, it centred on proposed pit closures and job losses. It involved roughly 142,000 miners, so really, really, really significant. I don't know if there has been uh, as significant an industrial action in my lifetime, and it went on for a huge length of time, really significantly. And I would urge people who are interested in activism and interested in Mark Ashton and also socialism. There was a really significant confrontation involving the miners, and this was the Orgreave incident. So it's also called the Battle of Orgreave, and there were thousands of arrests. And really, this miners' dispute triggered a huge decline in union power, but it was a really bitter, long in, industrial action. It went from March 1984 to March 1985. And during that time, people had um, a lot of people were forced into starvation. And it was really very challenging for people to make ends meet. There was a little bit of strike pay, but a lot of people were physically going hungry. And it was really very difficult for people to survive. The media coverage was really polarized, and the strike became a bit of a culture war. And it was all about sort of class conflict and, people who were paid monthly thinking that they were much better than people who were paid weekly. And there was a huge human cost to this dispute. Seeing what had happened and the real hardship that people were going through really triggered in Mark that awareness of hardship that he had seen in Bangladesh. So he wanted to do something. So in July 1984, there was a Pride bucket collection. So a couple of people were collecting money at London Pride. And it was really interesting because Mark had interviewed Mike Jackson. So Mike is wearing the glasses in this photo, and they had worked together on the helpline, and it was really lovely because they realized that they should actually do something to help. So they had a first small meeting to create a grassroots organization called Lesbian and Gay Support the Minors. And the purpose of this was to raise funds, real practical support, and build direct links with the minors. And this was about fundraising, visiting people, and also a public message of solidarity. There were bucket collections, and there was also a really amazing benefit gig that Mark and Mike organised, and a number of really incredible people played at. Significantly, Jimmy Somerville and Richard Coles sang there, and it raised a huge amount of money. They also visited mining communities and really wanted to create a message where they reclaimed slurs. So in one of the photos here, Mark designed this T-shirt, and it's "Pits and Perverts support the miners." So that was a very clear message of solidarity with the striking miners. Mark was really very, very energetic and very humorous, and he really loved to perform. I know some of his friends have told me, early on in his life, he performed in pantomimes, in school plays, and also he used to like pretend to dress up as a priest and have masses, which I really find quite funny. Um, but he was also able to connect with people who weren't like him. And I think that's a real thing about people who are from here. He was able to cross class lines, and he was also able to build trust with people who weren't like him. Really sadly, Mark died on the 11th of February, 1984, or sorry, 1987. This was only around 2 weeks after being diagnosed with an AIDS related illness. And it's really very tough and very difficult for us now to imagine the stigma and very limited treatments that were available to people. So really, it's very difficult now to imagine, but the activists who were working within the LGBTQIA community would have been attending a huge number of funerals. And there were things like funeral fatigue where people just simply couldn't go to another funeral because the emotion was so overwhelming. It's really, this is very sad because now we have very effective treatments where people who have HIV can live perfectly well with effective treatment, and indeed they cannot pass it on with with effective treatment. But this was before all of that happened, so it was a real era of fear. Mark's friends were very much like him in that they were all about practical benefit, and they were all about giving something back and helping people whenever they need it most. So there were a number of ways that Mark's life has touched people. The trade union membership really, up even until now, really remember Mark Ashton as somebody who did cross those class divides and acted in a way of solidarity with people who are different from them but have similar struggles. And the shortly after Mark's death, there was a Labour conference, and at the Labour conference, they have all sorts of motions which are put forward, and those have to be voted on by their membership. And it was really, I think, quite moving that the union, which there was a motion put forward recognizing LGBTQIA plus equality, and the lead union in that vote was the National Union of Miners, and um, that wasn't unconnected to what we have been talking about this evening. The National Union of Miners realized the difficulties that LGBTQIA plus people faced, and they wanted to address that in a very practical way. And what I find really significant is that that motion passed, and it was through the strength of the trade union movement that Tony Blair, love him or loathe him or like him or whatever, you can have your own views. He was voted on a platform of the trade unions, which included this motion for LGBTQIA plus equality. And his government obviously delivered for some of us civil marriage equality. So there's a really clear line from Mark Ashton's activism and advocacy to some of the rights that we enjoy today. There was also a really beautiful, very personal act where a number of Mark's closest friends got together and realized that they wanted to give people very practical support, and they established the Mark Ashton Trust. And this trust was principally to raise money for people living with HIV and living with AIDS. And that raised a considerable amount of money, particularly again from the trade union movement. It is really very beautiful to go back over the Mark Ashton Trust sort of donation wall, and you see trade unions donating money around Mark Ashton's birthday and around the anniversary of his death. It's probably his cultural legacy and Pride, the movie, which was released in 2014, for which Mark has really come to the attention of a lot of people, and particularly younger people. What I love about this film is that it's a little bit magical, and it's probably a little bit even more magical for me, considering I have met a number of the people involved in the film and the real life people behind the actors. And the story of Mark Ashton, Mike Jackson, and Lesbian and Gay Support the Miners work was dramatized in this film by Stephen Beresford. And Stephen Beresford's partner had always told him about this story. But Stephen Beresford really thought that the story couldn't possibly be true and that it was a bit of an urban legend, until somebody said to Stephen, I know who you need to speak to. You need to speak to Mike Jackson, for he is the keeper of secrets. It was something like that. So he met Mike, and Mike told him the story. And Mike is a brilliant activist who has an incredible archival instinct for all of these things. And Mike told him the whole story. And really, what I love is that the film actually had to have a little bit of artistic license applied to it, because if you've seen the film, and there's a particular scene where there's some of the characters are sort of fictionalized, but a lot of the characters are real. And there's a particularly beautiful scene where this woman appears from a kitchen in the hall in Delight, and she says, "Di, your gays have arrived." And these six queer people walk in, what I really love was that those people walk into the hall and there's silence from everybody sitting around, and that silence is eventually broken whenever some very, very feisty Welsh women intervene and encourage the Welsh people to show a little bit of hospitality. The reality is that that is slightly fictionalized because, in reality, and Stephen Beresford thought that this wouldn't be believable, but in reality, there were over 26 or 27 LGBTQIA plus people who made the journey from London to Wales. And whenever they walked into the hall, rather than being met with silence, they were actually met with something very different. They were met with applause and a standing ovation. And that was the solidarity that these Welsh people felt for lesbians and gay support the minors. And I really, really love that this has really made Mark's legacy live on. Just for closing, I think there are probably a few lessons from Mark's life. So his life was about cross-movement solidarity, what we may now call intersectional approaches. And it's also about grassroots organizing and helping to shift narratives. While more corporate approaches are very valuable, grassroots has a bit of an authenticity that really resonates with a lot of people. And really, the final thing that I wanted to mention was memorialization matters. So there is this plaque that you can see on screen in Marchmont Street above Gays the Word. And that is where Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors had a number of their meetings in the basement. There's also a park named after Mark in Paris. There is a plaque to him in Delaeth. And there's also a mural featuring him and Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors outside Barcelona for a number of years now, and things in this place do not move with any degree of speed. But this has even surprised me. But just over 5 years ago, I started a campaign for a blue plaque or some form of memorial to Mark Ashton in Portrush. And I'm really pleased that at very long last, Causeway Coast and Glens Council have given me really firm indications that a plaque will be put up, hopefully very soon, but you never know in this place. But I really appreciate the support of Mary Ellen and Joe, and Mary Ellen's Cork predecessor, Richard, for their support with the Mark Ashton campaign. So that's all from me, and I hope that you've learned a couple of things and that you've enjoyed listening to me rattle on about Mark, because I am very, very fond of him.
Amazing, Jude. Thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot of information that wasn't included in the film, in the movie Pride. So thank you for that. And this is going to be a valuable resource for us to have as well for future generations. So we'll have time for a few questions. If anyone
Do I
has a
have
question.
two?
Yes, go ahead, Marielle.
Thanks, Jude. That was class. You kind of answered a few of the wee questions I had jotted down, so I've had to think of another one for you. So, why was the alliance between the LGSM and the miners so radical for the time? And what do you think does Mark's role reveal about intersectional activism? And how can we kind of use what he done back in the 80s to help some of those within our community who are being attacked today. So basically, if Mark was alive today, what contemporary LGBTQI plus or social justice issues might he prioritize and why? There's two questions for you.
Thanks so much, Mary Ellen. It's lovely to hear you again. I think it was very radical for its time because, you know, there was a very uneven decriminalisation of homosexuality across the UK and Ireland. We are talking about the early 80s, so it wasn't until the 90s that homosexuality was decriminalised in Ireland, and it wasn't, it was kind of on the cusp of, the very early days of being decriminalised in Northern Ireland or the north of Ireland. So it was a really challenging time. The disapproval, the public disapproval of LGBTQIA plus people was really significant. The vast majority of people did not agree that it was okay to be LGBTQIA plus or lesbian and gay. There wouldn't have been the same sort of representation in terms of letters and identification. And, the British press said some really, really horrible things about the striking miners. It really was a class divide where people didn't have any sort of identification or point of reference with working class Welsh people. There was a lot of people, and I think there's a beautiful clip where Mark talks about people need to look at their lights and think, oh, the energy from that comes from coal, and would you want to go down and dig in the coal mines? And so there wasn't that connectedness, and I think that really for Mark was around Bangladesh, where he realized that the clothes that he could buy in, I'm trying to think what was around in the 1980s, but like say C&A and British Home Stores or something like that. Those things, yeah, C&A in Belfast, those clothes came all the way from Bangladesh, and actually that we were all part of like a tapestry of life. I think Mark's ability and the strength of his activism was by looking beyond the traditional communities. And I think it's very important that, whenever we are thinking about his legacy and about him, considering him as an inspiration, it is not, you don't look for allies in your friend group, you look for allies outside that. And I think, as we have achieved so much, it's very easy to think that everything's fine. But the reality, as a lot of us know, is that there are people who cannot be out in rural parts of this world. Even in Portrush, there are still challenges for people coming out, and that's very, very difficult. There's also the othering of vulnerable minorities. So if we sort of think about, what the tabloids were saying about the about gay people in particular. So the Sun, for example, ran a campaign that said "Fly Away Gay," and if gays didn't want to live in the UK, that the Sun would pay for their flights to go to, I think it was one of the Scandinavian countries. There were also really horrendous things around HIV and AIDS. Really, that was all completely weaponized against the LGBTQIA community. And, the same newspapers are doing the same things currently about gender non-conforming people, trans people. And I think that is possibly one of the clearest lessons from Mark. It's about organization as well. You have to be very strategic about this. Mark and Mike did not want to send the money to Wales. They wanted to go down and deliver the money. So they actually wanted to meet the people and sort of just have a bit of a chat and a bit of hospitality with them. And that really resonated. And I think, what my own views of kind of the Pride movement um, really match those of Mark. It is about having difficult conversations and going slightly outside your comfort zone to have discussions and explain the challenges that you're living through and that your community is living through. And that is how we kind of progress. And I think Mark and Mike and all of the other LGSMers, they've given us that really amazing template for activism.
Excellent, Jude. Thank you. A wee question from
Thank you.
John.
It was just a comment. I live in Northern Ireland now, but in the early 1980s, I was working in London for the trade union movement, and also, as it happens, with the Bangladeshi community in East London. And just to reinforce what Jude has said and Claire's question, the trade union movement at the time was incredibly patriarchal. It was very heteronormative. It was about a very masculine view of labor, and women. The women supporting the miners were seen as making the tea and providing the cakes, and the wives of the miners turned that upside down completely, and that was really important. But also, the assumption was that there was no meeting between black minority ethnic communities and the mainstream, in inverted commas, trade union movement. I was actually working on racism within the trade union movement at the time. That was what I was doing. And it was a real eye-opener to the miners that they were getting support from, for example, the East End Bangladeshi community. It was an eye-opener for the Bangladeshi community that there were actually Asian miners in the Nottinghamshire coalfields, for example, on all of that. So it was absolutely the beginnings of looking at intersectionality in lots of ways. And just on a very practical thing, my memory of one of the most important things that lesbians and gay support the miners did is that when there were demonstrations in London, they provided accommodation to the miners that came up from Wales and from down from Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire and so on. And that experience of living with lesbians and gays was formative for people as I remember it. So it wasn't just the fundraising, it wasn't just the going in person to get the money, it was that thing as well. That's how I remember it anyway.
Here, Jude, I couldn't help but laugh whenever you describe Portrush as being the North Coast Riviera. Because, well, I don't know if you realise where I'm from. I'm from Cloughmills originally, right? So after school, Mum used to take us every day somewhere different. Cushendun, Cushendall, Ballycastle, Portrush, Portstewart to the beach. And then my parents now live in Portrush. As far as I'm concerned, nobody really up there calls it the North Coast Riviera. Sorry.
Yeah, it's definitely a world away from London. I think Portrush is just really, it's very beautiful and very scenic, and it's also very wild and very rural. I love that you can see the Sea of Moyle, you can see the Irish Sea, and then you can see out to Donegal and the Atlantic, and I think that's just a really powerful place for sort of reflection. I really love. I'd sort of forgotten about John, your point about the protests in London and the lesbians and gay support the miners putting up the protesters. I think one of my favorite things, and I was actually lucky enough to see it, um, in Bishopsgate Museum, the Bishopsgate Institute in central London. They have a really incredible archive. So you can actually you can see so many valuable items of queer heritage. But I think one of my favorites was from Chris Birch's collection. And Chris died relatively recently, but he was one of Mark's friends and was a trustee of the Mark Ashton Trust. Um, but Mark had left Chris a number of things. I think there were some papers that I looked at, but one of them was a police truncheon. And there's dispute over how this police truncheon ended up in Mark's possession. One version of it is that he stole it. So that is the official version. However, I have it on very good authority that Mark and a number of the LGSM people were making such a racket at one of the protests that eventually one of the policemen apparently said, like, is there any way you could quieten down? Like, can you just quieten down? And Mark said, I'll quieten down if you give me your truncheon. And apparently that the policeman gave him his truncheon. So that's now in Bishopsgate Institute. It's a beautiful place if you're ever in London. Really, really good to visit.
Here, I was in London a few weeks ago, and I went to Queer Britain. Now, it was really
Lovely.
interesting.
Yeah.
I'd never been there before. It was fascinating. But I felt, though, that they tried to do sort of too many, because it's quite a small exhibition room. And I mean, there must have been maybe 8 or 9 different topics. I felt really if they'd concentrated maybe in 2 or 3, it would have been maybe a bit better, because it was too many in such a small place. But it was still very interesting.
Yeah. And, I think that, the other thing, and, this is, I think the value of the project, we have to remember that each of us has lived through some form of queer history. I remember where I was whenever marriage equality was declared in Dublin. It's quite funny. I have badges that I've made that I've seen in documentaries now. But, even, old papers around, pride flyers or pride t-shirts, those are very valuable because I think they do show part of our history. And, that's why I love our archive. We have a digital archive, so we just take a good quality photo of the item and then we share that. And, we save those stories and that history because, a lot of this is really at risk of being lost. Joe, just to kind of go off topic, I really love Joe's podcast, but I think one of my favorite episodes is with Harry or Ms. May, and that's the only voice recording video that we have with what we think is Belfast's first drag queen, who was performing from before the conflict broke out in 1968. So, I mean, like, Joe got that interview and they sat down together, and then, sadly, Harry passed away. And, that little bit of history would have been lost apart from Joe having that chat.
Yeah. Harry was a lovely fella. Really nice guy.
I think, can I just jump in there a second? I think the content tonight has been absolutely fabulous. I didn't know Mark at all or know about him, unfortunately. But what I did enjoy about your presentation tonight is all of the minor strike. I lived through that as a young boy, and Arthur Scargill and, the Prime Minister and everything, Margaret Thatcher. I lived through all that. And I remember my father was working class as well, and he supported the miners. And the hair, we used to stand at the back of our necks wondering what was going to happen next. So I enjoyed the whole content tonight and your whole presentation tonight, because it just takes me back to a time of growing up. And it wouldn't matter where you were, Northern Ireland or England or whatever, it was the same. You either supported the miners or you didn't. You know, if you were working class, you supported them. If you weren't, really, you were silent. You just didn't say anything. But what I just wanted to say that I really, really learned. I always learn something at these presentations that we do here. This is only my second one, and I want to thank you for just educating me and talking about a time that I do remember, that I did live through, you know, as a young boy. And it's just been amazing to listen to you, especially to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, really appreciate that. I think one of the I'll send out I'll get Joe to send out some wee links afterwards. But you know,
Yes,
I mentioned Orgreave,
yes,
and Orgreave was a very I think it remains a miscarriage of justice. There were the way in which that was policed was horrific.
yeah,
And there were a number of injuries and a number of people died at it.
yes,
And
yes,
the Orgreave campaign continues to campaign for the truth about what happened.
yes,
And you know, I think it's actually chilling to think about the way Orgreave was policed, and there were a couple of other things that happened just after. This was to was it West Yorkshire Police, West Yorkshire and Riding Police, I think. But Orgreave happened. There were a couple of independent things that happened independently afterwards, where
yes.
police had a culture of hazing new members, and there was this chilling, very chilling episode where they tried to kidnap a new recruit, and that led to the resignation of that chief constable, who was very, very experienced. And also, I think the Yorkshire Ripper had happened. So there were a series of catastrophes and poor policing, but because of Orgreave, um, the chief constable had to stand down, and a very inexperienced one took his place. And that very inexperienced one was the person who led the police planning for Hillsborough.
Oh,
So
Oh,
if Orgreave had, if Orgreave had been properly policed, potentially Hillsborough wouldn't have happened.
oh,
It's really chilling. The Hillsborough documentary that was out in about 2016, 2017, it tells the story and explains that section of history, because it's really horrendous. But it gives a real sense of, you know, the outrage and the just how tough the time was.
yeah. It's funny you should bring that up. Yesterday, I was actually given a link to the story of Orgreave yesterday.
Ooh,
So, and that's on my agenda to watch tonight or tomorrow morning. So I'm amazed that that you brought that up. I haven't watched it yet, but at least I've got some sort of an introduction. You know, there were
you
difficult
mentioned,
times.
sorry, you mentioned there Hillsborough. Jude, you probably know, but
mm,
I am a Liverpool supporter,
mhm,
but it was your man Phil Scratton that wrote the book on that. It's a very interesting book. Now I have the book.
yeah.
Okay, any more questions just before we end the recording?
Just a big thank you again. I really appreciate
Yes,
it from
thanks
my
very
point
much.
of
That was
view.
very interesting,
Absolutely
Jude.
wonderful. Thank you.
Yep, and there's a couple of comments in the chat, Jude, that are also echoing what everyone has said. Is very interesting presentation, and they're very grateful. So I'm just going to end the recording, and then we can take a few more questions for anyone who didn't want to be on camera.